Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard. In this series, we're going to take a look at every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army, or you're thinking of picking up some of Papa Nurgle's finest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the secondary missions from Warzone Nephilim, and how you can utilise those to max out your victory points as best as possible. So let's dive in and take a look at the secondary missions specific to the Death Guard. So first up, in the No Mercy No Respite category, we've got Fleeing Vectors. At the end of each player's turn, score 1 victory point if 7 or more enemy models were destroyed by attacks made by Death Guard models from your army that turn. If 7 or more of those were from plague weapons, then it is 1 additional victory point. Also, at the end of each morale phase, score 2 victory points if 1 or more enemy units failed morale, and if any of those units had models destroyed by plague weapons, you would score an additional victory point on top for that. So overall, against the average army, a very, very good secondary. If there's any propensity towards infantry in the army, killing 7 models some turns isn't out of the question. And of course, you're primarily going to be using plague weapons, though you will have some models that don't necessarily use plague weapons. So you're not necessarily going to get the 1 or 2 victory points for killing 7 models every turn. It's going to be a lot harder to do that turn 1 because you're almost certainly reliant on shooting. And outside of the Plague Burst Crawler, there aren't an awful lot of long-range plague weapons to get those kills with. But certainly this is one reason to take a Plague Burst Crawler, in that the entropy cannons and mortars, whilst they may be better suited on higher impact targets, maybe trying to take out an enemy vehicle or monster, which I think I probably would still do most of the time turn 1. If that isn't an imminent threat, or you think that the victory points are going to be more relevant to winning the game long term, then you may wish to instead focus on an infantry squad, try and remove as many models as you can from it, and as a result, hopefully they'll fail morale, and at least you'd get the 3 victory points for that if they do. But if you do manage to kill a total of 7, and they were all with plague weapons, or at least 7 of them were with plague weapons, you could score your full 5 on that each turn quite reasonably, at least from turn 2 to 3 onwards. And of course, you can only score a maximum of 15 points on it, so feasibly maxing it out a couple of times in the game should mean you score your maximum 15. The next there is, in fact, before we do, so comparison-wise here, we've got no prisoners, so you get 1/10 of the wounds you've killed in infantry. Grind them down is 3 points if you killed more units than you lost in the battle round. And to the last, I don't believe exists anymore. I don't know why it's still showing on here, but okay, it is what it is. I should probably use the book, actually. But either way, it's not up against anything that you'd want to take over this. Even if the army was purely infantry, you would be really happy taking Fleeing Vectors. I think the only alternative is grind them down. You might want to take that against something like, say, Knights, because Fleeing Vectors isn't going to be good against Knights. With that being said, though, you might ignore No Mercy, No Respite altogether for that and just take a Bring It Down and maybe something else. So, again, Fleeing Vectors, very, very good against anything that isn't a hyper-elite big unit army like Knights or Chaos Knights. Next up, we've got Battlefield Supremacy. Now, I don't particularly like this one, but I won't deny that it is strong. So we've got so you get 3 victory points at the end of the game for each of these conditions. 1 or more Death Guard units from your army are wholly within your opponent's deployment zone, and 1 is wholly within your own deployment zone. That's probably the most difficult one to get, I'd say. Not necessarily difficult, but it forces you to play in a particular way. Keeping 1 in your deployment zone, not that unreasonable if you've got an objective in there that you're protecting the whole game. But getting 1 up into your opponent's deployment zone, particularly if they've pushed out of it, You don't want to be just leaving a unit in their deployment zone turn 4 and 5 that's not otherwise doing anything. It may be relevant to have the 3 victory points over whatever they could have achieved in those turns, but to me it just feels bad. The rest aren't so bad though. 1 or more Death Guard units from your army are wholly within 3 different table quarters and are more than 6 inch away from the lines that you would draw to divide the table into quarters. 1 or more Death Guard units are wholly within the 4 table quarters. So if you are in all 4, you score 6 victory points on that. 1 for being within 3 and 1 for being within 4, or rather 3 each for those. You control half or more of the total objective markers on the battlefield, and there are Death Guard units from your army within range of those objective markers, and every objective marker is within contagion range of 1 or more contagion abilities that Death Guard units from your army have. Now, I think having something in every quarter and having something within contagion range of every objective isn't that unreasonable unless you're getting tabled. Now, the reason I don't like this one is because although it is fairly difficult to table Death Guard, it certainly can happen. And not only would you potentially be losing the game just through being tabled, but you're going to drop potentially the full 15 victory points here by not having enough units to at least go in 3 table quarters. So for me, it kind of feels like a lose more or win more pick. But again, in some matchups where it's a tight game, nobody's been able to really remove much from the other opponent's army, then Battlefield Supremacy Despoiled Ground could be particularly relevant because, again, you have got the ability to score the full 15 as long as you've got a handful of units still available on the board. But again, the downside being you are very slow for the majority of the units that will still be sticking around that long. And so if they're not already in the right position, it's going to be very difficult to try and squeeze the extra points out of it. So an alternative to that, you can have a progressive where you'll score 2 victory points if 1 unit from your army is wholly within your opponent's deployment zone, and score 4 victory points at the end of the turn if instead 2 or more units are wholly within your opponent's deployment zone, excluding aircraft. But you're not going to have any aircraft in Death Guard. Little bit easier to pick up on that one, I think, or at least pick up 8 to 12 points consistently, because of course you can strike in from turn 2, you can then look to move up the board, maybe make a charge turn 3 and be in their deployment zone if they've not screened you out very effectively. If you are picking behind enemy lines, it is going to give your opponent the nod to make sure that they stop you getting in their deployment zone, so you may have difficulty with it. But I do think in the average game, behind enemy lines at least is on a par for being able to score that 8 to 12 quite consistently. And then you've got engage on all fronts, which is basically the same thing as the Death Guard one, but not quite as good in my opinion. So I think if you are going Battlefield Supremacy, most of the time you probably will pick the Death Guard Despoiled Ground, but I think that's probably the weakest of the 3. Against something like, say, Knights, it's probably that bit easier because they don't necessarily have that wide presence everywhere once you've taken out a Knight or 2. But again, it is going to be more difficult against armies that have a lot of units and can screen you out of their deployment zone for the whole game, making it very difficult to ever score that 3 points on there. And then the third one here, we got Shadow Operations, which is Spread the Sickness, which has been improved since the codex itself. So it's an action. 1 Death Guard infantry unit from your army can start to perform this action at the end of the movement phase if it's within range of an objective marker you control that has not been contaminated by your army. The action is completed at the end of the turn. If completed, if the unit that performed the action has objective secure, then the marker is said to have been contaminated. So your Terminators and your Plague Marines, they can get it done. Otherwise, you roll a d6, and on a 4-up, that objective marker is said to be contaminated. So if you're rolling your Poxwalkers on there, as far as I'm aware, they're not OBSEC anymore. So they are rolling a 4-up, but if they're sat on the objective marker for 2 or 3 turns, on average, they're going to get it eventually. It would be a bit of a shame if you kept rolling less than a 4 over and over all game, but I think that's a risk you're willing to take. You could possibly swing Plague Marines over there if you really had to later in the game, just to make sure you can secure it. You score 3 victory points each time an objective marker in your deployment zone has been contaminated, and 4 victory points each time an objective marker not in your deployment zone has been contaminated. So you only need to hit 4 of the objective markers if one of them is in your deployment, 3 for that, and then 12 for the other 3 that you contaminate, brings you to the total 15, which is a fantastic secondary. I wouldn't bother taking any of the other shadow operations over this one because only Poxwalkers can only do this action. So if you take any of the others, your Poxwalkers can't do actions for you at all. So for me, Spread the Sickness, fantastic improvement. Definitely worth taking in pretty much every scenario. You always want to be pushing out onto 3 to 4 objectives minimum, if not the full 5 if you can get them. So being able to complete that action isn't necessarily a downside, particularly if you've gone with a melee set of Plague Marines, or maybe, your Blight Lords have just got bolters. You're not necessarily missing out with no shooting for that unit for a turn. So getting that done early with an OBSEC unit, just to guarantee you've got those points in the bank, is very, very nice. For these two, I think on the average selection, I will probably be picking Fleeing Vectors, Spread the Sickness, and very probably something from Purge the Enemy, depending what the opponent's bring in. Sometimes there will be a lot of characters, so Assassination's good. Bring It Down can be very good as well, depending if there's a lot of monsters and vehicles. Otherwise, maybe you'd have a Bore the Witch in there. I think I'd be very flexible with the other one. And worst comes to worst, I'd pick Despoiled Ground most likely over anything else in the Battlefield Supremacy slot. For me, that is the weak one, but you can still get the full 15 out of it. Given Death Guard are very durable, it's the sort of army where you might expect to table your opponent and still lose on points. So that means that having that does mean you can claw back potentially the full 15 at the end of the game if you need to. So overall, I think fantastic changes to the Death Guard secondaries, and although I do think the buffs to the army do cement them to at least tier 2 now, I think they have become very strong. I think the secondaries being as good as they are really cement them in that sort of tier 2 spot. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say they're tier 1, but I do think they're the sort of army that if you come up against in a tournament, you really are thinking, how do I make sure that this army doesn't ruin my record? Because you're not necessarily going to be able to beat Death Guard by a significant margin, even if you do beat them. And as it goes, I really love that from a lore perspective, because that is exactly how the Death Guard fight. They grind you down over a long period of time. They're not trying to strike in and do you over immediately. And I think that the quality of the army since the changes and the quality of the secondaries you'll be picking will go some way to making your opponent feel that sort of dread that the Imperial citizenry will have at the Siege of Terror. So that's everything for the secondaries. I think they're great picks. I don't think you can go wrong picking all 3, but at the bare minimum, you're probably going to pick 2 out of the 3 for pretty much every game. Let me know what you think. Are you planning on running all 3? Or if not, are you planning on running one other one? I wouldn't advise taking any less than 2 of them because they are very strong. But against, as we've said, particularly Knights, it might only be relevant to take Spread the Sickness. But otherwise, do you have other feelings about it? I'm not saying you're wrong if you do, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and I'll get back to you in the comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.